Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 31st video in our Master Series and the first video in the next phase. And I call this phase first phase processing. This is normally dealing with any processing done on individual tracks. We'll be dealing with a lot of signal processing issues and some ones that are a little bit different than the ones we did in the editing phase. So basically, when we get into this phase that we talked about in series 9 and 10, and I do believe 6, about saving a copy of your session at each stage. So when I get done with my editing stage, I save a whole copy. I make a complete copy of that whole song file and I save a copy of it. Does that make sense? It's a lot. Sometimes it works out to be a lot of gigabytes, but in the end I can just throw everything away that I really don't need to save, and I can go pick through it. Some things I might want to save for later or something like that, but I can get it cleaned up to just the normal song file and the files that are going with that at the end. But it's a great way to, if you have issues, you can go back to any phase and go, there's your clean file before that phase started or when that other phase ended, and really have some material that hasn't been, messed with or you've worked on and done things to. So anyway, after this, we basically want to do a general visual auditory inspection of the file and the song file. Make just sure things are set up the way it's supposed to be set up, and the DAW and the session set up the way it's supposed to be, and just some general cleanup and things like that. Also, we already went through starting up a session in 9 and 10, so we don't need to talk about that too much. And also, I want to address a couple key points. This is the first key point, as I always normally mix and process about 85 dB. As I'm going along, sometimes I'll turn things up sometimes or turn things down really low to hear if I'm having issues with some type of processing or something like that. But most of the time I'll mix right around that level. Sometimes a little bit louder, but most of the time right around there is a good place to mix or process, depending on your system and depending on your setup in your studio. But normally that's a pretty good place to start. Next, I'll talk about processing at the highest sample rate and bit depth possible. Now, I know nowadays you can get some unrealistic high sample rates and bit depths, but normally, I'm talking about, I go 64-bit and I go, my sample rate's at least 96 kilohertz. And that way that, I've got really good audio quality while I'm doing my editing, processing, things like that. And also when I mix down, that if there's any type of formatting happening that's going to cause loss of information, that there's a better chance of coming out with a better product from the mix down or the formatting if you're working from a higher bit depth and a sample rate. So I always keep that in mind. Also, that increase your block and buffer size, up while you're processing, crank it up. I normally put it up just about as high as my DAW will go most of the time when I'm processing, because sometimes I'll do some pretty elaborate processing. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about is I render as I go. So when I get done like I do, let's say I've done, I'll go through here and I've done some sound sculpting. This is the next part on it. And I've done sound sculpting. When I get done, I render that track with the effects and the processing I've done on it and bounce the track. And then I move on to the next thing. Now, as you get better, that isn't going to be that big a deal. But as you become a better engineer, sometimes it's a good idea to save an unprocessed copy of that track while you're processing that track, if you're doing a lot of heavy processing on it, or when you're just learning. That way you can always go back. You can go, well, but I did that, and then, I got it all screwed up, and before I started processing, I saved a copy of that track just in case. And, that's a huge thing. Just kind of remember that. Also, go light. You can always add more sugar to water later, but it's very difficult to take sugar out of water. And you want to mess around with RX or something like that to try to fix things that you've changed your mind on or you screwed up. That's great, but you can always add more later. So go light sometimes if you ain't really sure. And another thing to really keep in mind is when you're processing, this is a huge thing. As you get better, this will happen probably less. But you will find that, as in when we talked about the editing and also in first phase processing here, that when you get into mixing, and I'll give you an example. I've got a vocal, and I'm going to use EQ as an example, but this can go for any type of editing or processing. And I went through the track. I've done all this processing, and I did some awesome EQ work on it, and it just sounded awesome. The vocals sounded so good. That single track all by itself sounded just, yeah. But I started trying to mix it into the mix, and it didn't sound as good. And so I basically went in there and I had to do some other EQ work to make it fit in the mix. So I had to cut some bass end out. I had to go in there and find around between 2K and 5K. I had to actually drag that down just a little bit more, and to get it, and then it sounded really good in the mix, and it was like, yeah, now it sounds great. But when I listen to that track by itself, it doesn't sound nowhere as good, near as good to me. But in the mix, with all the other sound around it, that it complementing the other sounds around it rather than fighting with them or causing issues, that it sound better doing a little bit of work. Now, normally, I don't normally take that into consideration too much most of the time when I'm processing individual tracks, because I want the individual tracks to sound as good as they can, because you get done, they might not agree, you might change your mind, but it's easier to go back and do a little bit of different work on it. Like I've EQ'd and it's done and I've rendered it, but I can always go back and do a little different EQ work on it. I cut out a little bit of bass. I dropped around between 2 and 5K kilohertz, and and it's great. Then does that make sense? So always keep that in mind, because that happens, and it happens a lot, because I'll get through and do that and go back and readjust processing I've done on it, because it's just not riding in that mix really well, and it needs to be EQ'd a little bit different, as an example, so that it works better in the mix that it's in with the complement of instruments that it's trying to work with. So always keep that in mind. It's a huge thing, the things that I'm talking about, that will save you tons of frustration. That you'll do things and you'll go on and you're not sitting around going, oh God, and getting frustrated and mad and fussing with stuff. And just know that kind of happens, and keep it in mind. That way it doesn't frustrate you and cause you, because that can be it was a huge frustration for me, because reverb was one of my biggest problems when I first started processing. I love reverb. I just love reverb, dude. I just do, yeah. Sounds just huge and spacey and stuff. I used to love reverb. And, I learned some real unhappy lessons about reverb, and it was really frustrating, really understanding. Spatialization was a really down, it really was, to understand, you'll understand as we get through this series and as we go through this series, that I don't use nowhere near as much reverb as I used to, and it sounds much better. But I always I love it. Love spatialization. And so, I learned some really hard lessons in my processing and my mixing dealing with reverb, because of how much I liked it, and I didn't need it like that. And it didn't sound as good when it was done, because there was just too much. So anyway, really keep those things in mind. And, that's another example, reverb, that, I used all that reverb on it, and it sounded great on that individual track. It was like, yeah, duh, and it was like, oh yeah, and it's like, I go mix it into the mix, and by the time I get done doing that with all those tracks, it sounds like a muddy mess, and it was like, and I couldn't figure out what was going on, it was like, well, it's too much, and you start, it's just like anything else, a little bit of salt in the soup, that it's okay. But when you add a little bit of salt from each one of the tracks, and it adds up, pretty soon you got a really salty soup, that doesn't taste nowhere near as good as you thought it was going to taste, because you've got all that little bit of salt on every one of those tracks that gets mixed up, that gets mixed into the mix, and then it starts making mud. That's a good example, because that can happen with any type of processing. Always keep that in mind. And I know that's long-winded, but those lessons are huge lessons that will help you immensely, and cause you to have a lot less frustration while you're going along. So anyway, after we get done with that, the next thing we wanted to talk about is duplicating the track. Always make a double of the track and name it duplicate of whatever you're doing, and put AB plugins on there, or if you're docking AB back and forth, whatever, to really be able to bounce back and forth and hear what you're doing well, to hear the difference of what you're causing. It's like you can loop little sections and really and hear exactly, really clearly, the difference between the two, to hear what you're actually causing and whether that's good or bad. And having the clean track to judge it against is a phenomenal tool that you will learn is one of your biggest tools. So, and it help you become better because you'll really be able to hear the difference in your processing. Because sometimes it's hard to hear when you're doing something to something and you might be adding just a little bit of harmonic content or a little bit of this or doing just a little bit of reverb. You'll see later on, sometimes I had minuscule amounts of things that you can hardly tell the difference, but it adds up. It's a little teeny bit of reverb. It's like 0.01% of reverb, of the wet and dry into this thing. And you can hardly hear it when you A-B back and forth, but it adds up across the mix. And then, it does sound spatially, like there's good spatialization, but it's really clean, does that make sense? And it's a huge thing to help you become a better processing engineer. So really keep that in mind and utilize that invaluable tool. So besides that, your visualization tools and the tools you have to hear, your headphones, just throw in on your headphones for a minute. What the heck is that? Does that sound good? And what, A-B back and forth? I know that sounds, I make it kind of comical, but it's true. And, your monitors have things set up well, and your visual aids, any aids that you have, spectrograms, scopes, I've got, Isotope Insight that I use a lot. I really like that one to really be able to visualize what's going on. Not only can it help you when your ear kind of tricks you, or if you get tired, or you're not hearing it quite right, and you haven't stepped away for a minute, take a break, because, a good example, besides you using them all so you really can see what's happening and hear what's happening when you make changes, is that sometimes your ears and your eyes, there's a lie happening. The equal loudness contour is an example of that. If I have a passage going on way low and I have a passage going on around 500 hertz, that if they're at the exact same level and my meters tell me they're at the same level, that it's going to sound like the stuff at 500 hertz is louder. It just will. That's where your ear hears sound. So you're going to have to push the bass end up, which the meter is going to tell you that the bass end is higher, obviously, but your ears are going to tell you that they sound the same level. And it's things like that, to really rely not only on your ears but on your meters also, so you can see what's going on. It will help you later when you're trying to mix stuff and get things put together well, and understanding audio engineering concepts and trusting your visual aids and your auditory aids to really do a good job. Any and all you can get a hold of that do a good job, that they're great, because then you can see minuscule things happening and big things happening. So you can actually visualize it as well as auditorily, hear it, what's going on, to make you a better engineer. So really keep that in mind. That is a huge thing. So besides that, we're getting into actually processing. So I've got a list here of what I normally go through. Now these things basically, I go through these one at a time. Sometimes I'll skip around, jump over things sometimes, depending on the production or what's going on or what's needed or what I think is needed. But we'll go through them one at a time and talk about each one of them, because by the time I get done going through all these, that the processing on the track is done as well as I think it can possibly be done. And also, sometimes we revisit things from like our editing phase. Once I start processing, I might do, equalization and some sound sculpting on something, and I have to revisit my ADSR. You see that video in my editing phase. Then I have to revisit that. You may have to revisit things from other phases, and we've talked about that. Sometimes you might have to go back and go, well, now that I'm done, I'm in the processing, I have to go back and re-edit this after I did some spatialization on it, I added reverb. Now I have to go fuss with the ADSR, on the tail end of it, or at the transient because I did some, sound sculpting on it. Now I've got this transient happening, but the rest of it sounds great. It's a huge thing to keep in mind. And by the time we get done with this, you should have a pretty good idea of how to process your individual tracks so that you can come out with some good sounding material, so that by the time you get into mixing, that you've got some well edited, well captured, and well processed tracks to mix together to come out with some really good sounding stuff. So Peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to our first phase processing. In the next video, we're going to get right into first phase processing and deal with possibly dirtying up the production. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this first video and our first phase processing, and I'll see you in the next video.